that piece of information and whether it is now accurate or not. Do we have an answer to it or not? In certain cases, for that answer to be true, if it is, then I have to be consistent and go into all of these other fields. So for instance, as we said, I may be looking into something that is in biology, but I also have to go and tweak and readjust my understanding in chemistry for this to be correct. I may have to go to the physics behind it and adjust it to make sure that it is correct. And the more I have to change outside of my theory for the theory to work, then logically we can assume that the more resistance there will be to my theory being accepted. Why? Because all these other people and all the work that they're doing will have to change. Whereas if I'm working on a topic, a hypothesis, a theory, which has no repercussions outside of itself, it's very limited in scope, there should be more likelihood that it is accepted. This is just human behavior. And that's why we said, this is where the discussion gets interesting. When I take my theory and bring it to a community of experts. What else? So this is one idea to keep in mind, the idea of a paradigm. Let's dig deeper into this human dimension. Many of us perhaps think that there is, or we don't pay attention to the fact that science does not exist in itself as an entity in the outside world. There is no such thing as science. Science is the scientists and the work that they do. The scientists and the principles that they apply, the beliefs that they carry, the tools that they have. And so, as soon as we keep this in mind, we start to remember that scientists are also human beings. So when we come to science and an idea is presented to them, it is not going to be necessarily true that just because this idea seems to be correct, seems to be valid, that it is going to be accepted as is. Sometimes there is a dimension of arrogance that plays. Where does this come from? Before I go any further, this is not our own analysis. Today there are fields. The big topic falls under a category of philosophy that I have studied for 20 years, that is called the philosophy of science. Beyond the philosophy of science, there are now fields called the ethnography of science or the anthropology of science. Anthropology by itself, ethnography by itself, is when an expert goes to study human beings in their natural environment by observing without intervening. So this is what the Europeans started to do a couple of centuries ago. They would go to Africa, they would go to South America, and they would try to study cultures that are unknown to them. And they put these principles in place where they say, I don't want to disrupt, I don't want to intervene directly so that I see them in the manner in which they react naturally. They conduct themselves naturally. With time, those same principles were taken by some experts and applied to the scientific community. They came to the scientific community and they said, let's observe the scientists when they are working in their natural environment without any intervention. So these are anthropologists, ethnographers. They are the ones who started to tell us that when you go to the scientific community with a new idea, in a lot of cases, the idea is not going to be accepted as good as it may be, as correct and as true as it may be. Why? We already saw one example of that, the paradigm. But beyond the paradigm, there are very human aspects to the interaction. One of these aspects is the arrogance. In a lot of cases, those who have studied the history of science, they've told us that new ideas, new theories are usually, not always, usually presented by younger scientists, newer scientists in the field. They come in with a lot of enthusiasm and passion. They're bright, they're full of energy. They tackle the problem in a fresh new way. And they propose something. The community is made up of authorities and experts who have been doing this kind of work for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's not easy for someone to just say, the 50 years of work that I have done is absolutely meaningless because this theory is now true. And all the work that goes with it, all the reputation that goes with it, is now down the drain if this theory is true. Do you think that it's easy for scientists to simply accept this because it is true and let go of a lifetime of work? And sometimes it's not a lifetime of work at a personal level. Sometimes it's a lifetime of work of teams made up of tens of scholars working together because they made assumptions. They worked based on foundations and theories that they took for granted. And now there's a new theory, a new piece of science that comes that completely,
easy
if it
for
is
scientists
true,
to simply
invalidate
accept
all of this
because it is true.
Of course,
and let
there's
go
going to
of
be
a
resistance.
lifetime
of work
beyond all of
and
this.
sometimes it's not a lifetime of work at a personal
Beyond
level.
all of this, the
Sometimes
manner
it's
in
a
which
lifetime
science
of work,
works,
and today much
of
more than
teams,
before, made up of tens of scholars
is that
working
science
together
is full of
because they made
biases.
assumptions. They worked based on
Science
foundations and
is
theories that they took for
financed
granted.
by specific
And
interests.
now there's a new theory. No one is doing science in a vacuum. There are some, but you don't really make a good living. And you can't get really far because you're not part of the real community. You can't influence the community that way. You need to be financed. The financing has to come from somewhere. So the scientific work that you're doing has to fall in some category. It could be industry. It could be sports. It could be medicine. It could be pharmaceuticals. It could be the government. Whatever it may be, someone has to have an interest in the type of work that you're doing. And this is a field that is highly, highly competitive. You have to produce results. Huge pressure to produce results. Huge pressure to publish those results and to present them to the world that you are advancing, that you are taking these salaries and this money for the funding and the research and you are producing results. If suddenly in the middle of the way you say, well, I can't keep going in this path because it seems that our foundations were all mistaken. We made a mistake 15 years ago that we're building on. Of course, we're not going to reach any conclusions. In a lot of cases, there is too much at stake. All this means is that you will be removed and there are 10,000 scientists in line waiting behind you who are saying, we are ready to jump into this position, to accept the financing and to produce the results you need. This is how science works today. We can't ignore this component and this dimension of how science works. Beyond all of this, what determines whether science is going to be, the new science, the new theory, the new hypothesis is going to be accepted or not? One other dimension, and this one is an important one other dimension is how much explanatory power it has. When I present something, it has to be able to explain the phenomena of the world. Sometimes there is something that explains the phenomena of the world 10%, 20%, 50%. And sometimes I present something that it can explain from what I know 90%. So usually beyond now the human dimension, I am looking for things that have a greater explanatory power. And there's a reason we're talking about this. When I take something like gravity, for instance, have human beings always believed in the notion of gravity that we have today? No. We go back about 2,000 years, a little bit more. Everybody says one of the greatest minds in human history, a philosopher by the name of Aristotle. If we read his writings, what we have from his writings today, how does he explain that bodies, if you leave them in the air, they fall to the ground? Did he believe in gravity? No. The idea of Aristotle of gravity is that there is something called the natural position or the natural movement of things. And what is the natural movement of things? He believed that the entire universe has a center, and the center of that universe is Earth. And Earth has a center. Earth is spherical or circular, and it has a center. And the reason why things fall to the ground is because naturally everything moves towards the center. And so if things could go beyond the ground, they would. But because there's something blocking them, they stop at the ground when they fall. But where are they trying to go? They're trying to go to the center of the earth. Why? Because based on his philosophical system, everything moves towards the center. There are no forces, there is no mass, there is no gravitational pull, none of that. This is the reason why things move to the center. And then in medieval times, there was another theory that came up, was called the impetus theory, accepted by some, especially in Europe, where if something moves, it means that there was a force pushing it. So if we want to apply that to gravity, we would say it's not that things are being pulled, it's that things are being pushed from above into the ground. And then you fast forward to the 17th century and you get universal gravitation, proposed by Newton. And he explains that based on classical physics, classical mechanics, and the laws with very clear constants, that there is a pull between the masses. And you can show the math behind it. And he established it with a very high level of accuracy. And then you fast forward a couple of centuries. And then you have Einstein, who presents his general relativity theory, which completely dismantles and undoes everything before. Because he says to understand gravity, because his theory goes way beyond gravity, one application becomes gravity. To understand gravity, you have to view the world, existence, as a four-dimensional fabric. So imagine that you take a piece of fabric, a sheet, and you take a big bowling ball. A bowling ball that you put in the middle. What happens to the fabric? It bends, it warps to handle, to accommodate the weight, the mass of the structure. What if I put something else now on that sheet? It's going to follow the same curve of the sheet and go towards where the greater mass is. And this is what gravity is. There's no external push and pull. Space itself is warping and curving. Why am I going through this? Because at the time of Aristotle, people believed that this is the best explanation they have for why things are falling. And that was the truth. And when Newton proposed his idea, that was the truth. This is the reason why things fall. And when Einstein proposed his idea, that was the truth. The warping, the curvature of time-space is the reason why things are what we call gravity. Those scientists themselves, did they think that this is the truth? No. When Einstein came up with his theory, did he lock his office and go home and never work again? No. He thought there are huge unknowns and huge problems in his theory, especially after the discoveries of quantum mechanics, which were invalidating things in his theory. Either quantum mechanics is true or relativity is true. General and special relativity. So they created a different science with different laws for quantum mechanics and quantum physics, separate from general relativity and special relativity. And today these are two separate entities. And Einstein was working to find a way to bring all of this together so that his theory makes sense, because it means that it's inconsistent. This is what we mean by explanatory power. How much can it explain? And so in the field, within the field, if you talk to the expert, they tell you, no, there are areas where we don't understand what's going on. We have to create things like dark matter and dark energy to make the math work. We have to come up with a theory like string theory to make the math work and the physics work, because otherwise it's not working out. But sometimes it's presented as science has found the solution and this is what it is. But that's not how it works. This is all in motion. And in fact, the reason why all of this happens, all this research has happened and people have told us this, is because they were asking a question. How does science evolve? How does science progress? If we understand this question, it means, why is science changing? And if science needs to change, it means that it is never the truth. It is a part of the truth. Why it works is because all the other pieces that we're trying to explain are suddenly consistent. It has enough power to explain either better or more of the world. So we accept. We move from one paradigm, the paradigm of Aristotle, to the paradigm of Newton, which is a very difficult thing to do in the scientific community. But we have to accept it. There were too many unknowns that Newton is now resolving with his theory. We have to accept it. There were too many unknowns that Einstein was able to resolve. So we have to accept it. Doesn't mean that this is the whole truth. This is a part of the truth. The reason why we're talking about this is that this is already two huge factors to keep in mind when today we are told science says. Before I accept this as my truth, when I'm told science has said, I have to say, whose science? Who is the science that says? Because there is no such thing as science. There are human beings who are doing science. And there are biases, and there are interests, and there are incomplete theories, and there is a human dimension to this. And beyond the human dimension, science itself is always changing. Which brings up another question. Are there things that don't change? Are there things that are fixed? Perhaps I need values, things that are universal, that regardless of how my interpretation and understanding of the world changes, those things don't change. And we believe that this is the role of religion. Those things don't change. An example of this is ethics, morals. When those people say, we're going to use science to decide how human beings live their lives, the biggest problem, and there are many problems with this, the biggest problem is that science is a blind tool. You can do anything you want with it. And this is exactly what happened. You go back in history, people who say that, they're either ignoring history or they are ignorant of history. And not even distant history. When Hitler came to power in Germany, he wasn't initially interested in science. And then he quickly realized that this is perhaps one of the greatest, most powerful, most influential tools that he can have in his arsenal to move his agenda. And in fact, the majority of the scientists in Germany participated in his endeavors and in his projects and his aims. There are some who rejected that because in many cases they were persecuted. They had Jewish ancestry, they left, they converted, they refused on ideological grounds, but the majority of them participated. And Germany went on a great investment in science. They worked at the biological level, at the genetic level, to do hygiene of their race, a cleansing of their race based on eugenics, because they said what had weakened the German culture over time is that they had mixed up with other cultures that were inferior. And that they now had a lot of people within their own society who were inferior mentally and physically. And so they were working on sterilization, preventing people from having more children. This is not theories, this is what happened. And they were conducting studies on human beings, horrible experiments in concentration camps and labor camps to see what were the limits of a human being's body. How much heat can they handle? What type of drugs can they handle? How much cold can they handle before they die? If they dissect them alive, what happens to them? And so on and so forth. All of that was what? Under the name of scientific progress. There was chemical work that eventually made it to the wars. Chlorine gas and mustard gas were used in the wars. They were considered to be atrocious ways of torturing soldiers to death. To the point where in World War I, Germany, as soon as they used it, the whole world said this is something that is too inhumane to ever be used. And then right away, the UK and the other forces against them started to use it as much, if not more. At the physical level, physics, the research became a race for better rockets and to start to have work towards the nuclear bomb. And eventually, the nuclear bomb was developed, and there's a whole chapter in the history of science of how that happened. Some say that the reason why Germany was not able to develop it was because the top scientist who was leading that work, he himself had red lines that he did not want to cross because he was afraid of the repercussions. No one knew the devastation that would result from a nuclear weapon. We're not sure what happens. We've never used one. Whereas others, they continued and they pursued that work. And some say no, Germany wanted to. If they could have, they would have. But finally, it was the United States that was able to develop the nuclear weapon. And then finally, the idea initially was that this would be a deterrent. I have a nuclear weapon so that others do not dare attack, not so that I use it. In World War II, the United States were not part of the war that was going on. They were not an active participant. Germany attacked on the east. It was mainly Russia that was dealing with them. And they attacked on the west. And then the Allies started to work together, France and UK and others. The US had nothing to do with any of this until 1941, when Japan, part of the Axis, part of the alliance with Germany, decided to attack the interests of the United States. In 1941, Japan attacked the naval base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. That's when the United States entered. And now they were an active participant. They were drawn into World War II. From 1941, now there was an open war, not only with the world because it was a world war, but specifically between the United States and Japan. Between 1941 until 1945. During this time, the United States developed the nuclear weapon. And here was a discussion internally going on. Do we use it or not? This is going to be a tremendous amount of devastation and damage. Do we go there or not? And the justification internally was that it makes sense to use it. Why? First of all, we are in a situation of war, and we have to show the world our might and power so that it becomes a retaliation to what the Japanese did against us, as well as a deterrent, so that this never happens again. And in fact, it's not only the Japanese that are going to surrender, but any other nation in the future would think 10 times or 100 times before ever even thinking of threatening, let alone attacking the United States. So we have to use this type of power. And this would put a much quicker end to the war. We don't need to drag wars for years. We can put an end to a war right away. And this would save lives. This would save American lives. I don't need to send soldiers to their death to fight long wars. I end the war right away, which ultimately saves lives. And so the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in August 6, 1945. It was called Little Boy. And the second bomb was dropped 3 days later on Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. It was called Fat Man. And that was the trigger that ended World War II. But it changed the world forever. The whole story that we're telling is not about history. The whole story is to take a chapter of the progress and evolution of science. Science is always evolving and progressing. It does not always necessarily mean that it is always going towards what is better. Science alone is a blind tool. Science alone is missing very large components, very large dimensions that we need for human life, individual life and collective life, social life. We believe that this does not come from science. Science is a tool to explore nature, to manipulate nature, but it lacks morals. It lacks ethics. It does not come, ethics and morals don't come from the science. When science runs rampant alone, it's easy to take it and justify any action, and we say this is all based on science. Science says, science allows. Today we have to apply our critical thinking to all of this. We're hearing a lot of science says today. We have to ask ourselves with a critical mind, when we are told science is saying so and so, I have to first remember that there are human beings behind it. There is no such thing as science in the outside world. There are scientists who are working with biases, with pressures, with funding, with interests. And science itself is an incomplete dimension. It's an incomplete tool. And it's a blind tool that is always changing. From 1910 till 1960s, the science of the world officially said cigarettes are good for you. The doctors, the scientists working everywhere, especially in the United States and the tobacco industry and elsewhere, they officially said cigarettes are good for you. Then the science suddenly started saying, we're not sure, maybe it's not that good. And then today the science says, it's horrible for you. It's a toxic substance. It's a poison that you're putting in your body. It's always the science saying. So we have to be careful. When we are hearing today science says, we have to have a bit of a critical mind. And this is not true. This is not new. This fight for the truth is not new. Has always existed and will continue to exist. And Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, in his mission, in his movement in Karbala, was definitely participating in that fight for the truth. At the time of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, the science was not about natural science. It was about religion. It was religious science. The religious scientists, the scholars of religion, were all saying certain things. If you are with Bani Umayyah, this is the truth. And if you are not, then you will be tortured, you will be exiled, your houses will be taken, you might be killed, which was happening for many years, leading all the way up to the time of Kufa and the time of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, where you have judges who were considered to be very competent. In the past we have talked about, for instance, one judge, Shuraih al-Qadi, who is the one who wrote the edicts against people like Hijr ibn Adi and the people of Kufa. For their love of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he would create claims. Because the one way to get through Hijr is to bribe him. If you bribe Hijr, he's willing to say anything, even though he was a true faqih. Hijr was a faqih and he was a rightful judge. Imam Ali alayhi salam kept him as judge during his khilafah. The problem is if you bribe him, you can make him say anything. And Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam rose against this. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, initially when he left al-Madinah al-Munawwarah, where he had lived his whole life. We said that the Imam went to the grave of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, which was to bid farewell to the Prophet. And this was the most difficult farewell that he had to do. To you and I, perhaps this is a grave. To Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, this is not just a grave. He talked to the Holy Prophet ﷺ, O Messenger of God, my grandfather, this is your son, Hussein, and the son of your daughter Fatima, and I want you to bear witness, he tells the holy grandfather. I want you to bear witness over your own nation that they have called us and then they have betrayed us. This is still in Medina, nothing has happened yet. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam tells his grandfather, they have called us and they have betrayed us. And they have not observed nor recognized my right over them. You have left me over your nation. Your nation does not recognize the right I have over them. This is a complaint. And Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, he ends that line by saying, and this is my complaint to you until the day I see you. And that's when we are told Imam al-Hussein falls asleep, sees the Holy Prophet ﷺ in his sleep. Imam al-Hussein right away afterwards, he rushes the next day to put his family together and he starts to get ready after he gave some sermons. Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, his brother, comes to him. Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah had spoken to the Imam, tried to convince him not to go on this journey. He was crying, the historians say. Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah came to Imam al-Hussein weeping and crying, telling Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, did we not talk about this? And did you not promise me that you would think about it? Why are you rushing in this journey? Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam told him, I have thought about it, and I thank you for your sincere advice. My brother, I want you to stay behind in Medina. Your mission is going to be to watch over those I leave behind and to let me know of anything, any developments that happen in Medina. As for myself and my companions, I have made up my mind and I am departing. And the Imam actually started to inform, and his brother would have understood this, that this is more than just a matter of opinion. He told him, even if there was a place for me to hide, I would not hide from Yazid. And here Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam started to indicate, their parting words, the Imam recited some verses of poetry that would make it clear that the Imam is working towards a divine mission. So Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, seeing that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is not going to give up, he tells him, then at least tell me, why are you taking the children and the women with you? Leave them behind. Why are you taking Zainab with you? She is the one that our father has left to guard over. We're her guardians. And I am afraid that once the holiest of the bloods is spilled, he's referring to the blood of Imam al-Hussein. He knows Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah what will happen. I am afraid that once the holiest of bloods is going to be spilled, what will be the outcome of these children and women? Where are you taking them? Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam told him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who wanted to see me martyred. And he is the one who wanted to see them captives. And we are told in one version of history that the Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam was hearing this discussion between her brothers, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. So she came to her brother Muhammad and she told him, my brother Muhammad, what are you saying? Are you actually trying to convince Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam not to let me accompany him? My foot is where the foot of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam will be. And my hand will always be in the hand of Imam al-Hussein. Wherever he rests, I will rest with him. Wherever he travels, I will travel with him. And I will stay with him until the end. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu ala al-Hussein wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussein wa ala awlad al-Hussein wa ala ashab al-Hussein wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.